The wedding had been perfect, or so it seemed. Mia Jefferson had waited for this day all her life. The grand church in Atlanta was filled with loved ones, the white roses were in full bloom, and the man she loved, Pastor Dominic Jefferson, had just vowed before God to cherish her forever. Dominic was admired by many, a devout preacher, a community leader, and a man who inspired others with his words. To Mia, he had always been a pillar of faith and strength, but the illusion shattered on their wedding night. As the reception wound down, Mia excused herself to freshen up. Their honeymoon suite at the Fairmont Hotel was exquisite, the kind of luxury she had dreamed of. She stepped out of the bathroom in her silk robe, anticipation fluttering in her stomach. She was ready to become his wife in every sense. But Dominic was nowhere in sight. The groom had excused himself minutes earlier, claiming he needed to talk with someone before they left. When Mia realized he'd been gone for nearly 20 minutes, she felt a strange unease creep into her bones. Then she heard it. Muffled voices, heavy breathing, the slight creak of a bed. The sound came from the adjoining room, a suite meant for the groomsmen. Mia frowned, stepping closer. The door was slightly ajar, and as she peeked inside, her world crumbled. There, in the dim glow of the bedside lamp, was Dominic, on his knees before his best man, Jared McCall. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened as if she were drowning. Jared groaned in pleasure, gripping Dominic's shoulders, unaware of her presence. And Dominic, the man who had just sworn before God to love her, was lost in an act of betrayal so unspeakable it made her stomach turn. Her head spun, her vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. Then rage took over. Mia didn't remember lunging forward. She didn't remember screaming, crying, or the exact moment she grabbed Jared's wrist and yanked him backward. All she knew was the overwhelming taste of salt and iron when she sank her teeth into Dominic's flesh. The room exploded into chaos. Dominic shrieked, blood gushing from his mutilated flesh. Jared stumbled backward, crashing into the dresser. Mia spat blood onto the floor, her body shaking. Her wedding night had become a nightmare. Dominic clutched his wound, his eyes wide with terror. "Mia, please!" But she wasn't listening. The walls of the room closed in, the reality of what had just happened hitting her like a freight train. Dominic collapsed onto the bed, his body convulsing as blood soaked the pristine white sheets. Mia turned and ran. She didn't stop running, not when she reached the hotel elevator. Not when she stepped onto the rainy streets of Atlanta, her wedding dress stained with blood. By the time she realized she was holding Dominic's severed flesh in her trembling hands, it was too late. The police sirens wailed in the distance. Someone had called 911, and the hunt for a murderer had just begun. Detective Marcus Reynolds had seen his fair share of gruesome crime scenes, but this was something else. The call had come in just after midnight, an assault at the Fairmont Hotel, a groom bleeding out in his honeymoon suite, the bride nowhere to be found. By the time Reynolds arrived, the hallway outside the suite was packed with uniformed officers, hotel staff, and curious guests. The scene was chaotic, but he pushed through the crowd, flashing his badge. Inside, the suite was a mess. Blood splattered the sheets and dripped onto the pristine carpet. A discarded tuxedo jacket lay crumpled in the corner. The air smelled of sweat, cologne, and something more metallic, something unmistakably human. Dominic Jefferson, still in his wedding attire, sat slumped on the bed, clutching a blood-soaked towel to his mouth. His hands trembled, his white shirt stained deep red. Jared McCall, the best man, stood frozen near the dresser, his face pale, his tie loosened. He looked like he might vomit. Reynolds adjusted his gloves. "All right, someone tell me what the hell happened here." Dominic groaned, unable to speak. Blood leaked through his fingers as paramedics worked to stabilize him. His entire lower face was wrapped in gauze. The wound was deep, brutal. Jared swallowed hard. "It was Mia. She bit him." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Bit him?" Jared nodded quickly. "It was crazy. She lost it, man. She walked in, saw us, and snapped. Next thing I know, she's screaming, lunging at Dom. And then," he gestured vaguely toward Dominic's bandaged face. Reynolds let that sit for a moment. He'd been in law, Enforcement long enough to know when someone was holding back. Jared was scared, rightfully so, but there was more to this story. He turned to Officer Lawson, who had been first on the scene. Any sign of the bride? Lawson shook his head. Witnesses say she ran out of the hotel barefoot, still in her wedding dress. We've got units checking the area. Reynolds sighed. A runaway bride covered in blood? It wouldn't take long before someone spotted her. He crouched beside Dominic, keeping his voice even. Pastor, I need you to confirm something for me. You and your best man, were you engaged in a sexual act when your wife walked in? Dominic's breathing hitched. His body tensed. Jared flinched. I wasn't asking you, Reynolds cut in, his gaze locked on Dominic. The pastor's eyes darted between Reynolds and Jared, before finally, weakly, he nodded. That changed everything. Reynolds stood up, running a hand down his face. All right, we're dealing with a crime of passion. He turned to one of the forensics officers. Bag anything with blood. Check the bathroom, the trash. I want her fingerprints, DNA, anything that gives us a trail. Then he faced Jared again. You were the only witness, which makes you important. But don't go far. I have more questions for you later. Jared swallowed and nodded. Reynolds glanced at Dominic one last time. The groom's eyes were unfocused, his pain clear. But underneath all that suffering, Reynolds saw something else. Fear. The man wasn't just afraid of the pain. He was afraid of something, or someone else. And Reynolds intended to find out exactly what. Detective Marcus Reynolds sipped his lukewarm coffee, eyes fixed on the glowing city map displayed on his office screen. Red markers pinpointed locations where Mia Jefferson had been spotted after fleeing the Fairmont Hotel. Witness reports placed her running barefoot through downtown Atlanta, her wedding dress stained with blood. But after 2 a.m., she vanished. No taxis picked her up. No security cameras captured her after she exited Peachtree Street. It was as if the night had swallowed her whole. A knock on the door snapped him from his thoughts. Officer Lawson stepped in, holding a manila folder. Forensics report just came in, he said, placing it on the desk. Reynolds flipped it open. Blood analysis confirmed it was Dominic's. The bite wound was deep. Mia had torn through muscle and nearly reached the bone. He exhaled. This wasn't just a moment of blind rage. This was something primal. Any leads on where she might be? Reynolds asked. Lawson shook his head. We checked her apartment. Empty. No sign of forced entry and nothing packed. Her car's still parked at the hotel. The parents claim they haven't heard from her. Reynolds rubbed his temples. Mia was a woman scorned, but she wasn't stupid. If she had managed to disappear this quickly, it meant she either had help or she'd been planning to run. All right, Reynolds said. Get a team to check bus and train stations. She wouldn't have taken an Uber. Too easy to trace. Look into any old friends or distant relatives she might go to, and put an alert out to hospitals. If she hurt herself or collapsed from exhaustion, someone might bring her in. Lawson nodded and left. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. There was something off about this case. If Mia had acted out of pure rage, she should have been easier to find. But she was moving like someone with a plan. And that meant she was either running from justice or from something much worse. 4:30 a.m. A new break. Reynolds was halfway through another report when his phone buzzed. Detective, came Officer Daniel's voice, tense and urgent. We got a hit. Woman matching Mia's description was seen entering an abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Witness says she looked terrified. Reynolds shot up from his chair. Send me the location. I'm on my way. Within minutes, he was speeding through the empty streets of Atlanta, sirens off. The church was an old Baptist building, long shut down due to financial struggles. It stood alone at the edge of a wooded area, its stained glass windows cracked, its front door barely hanging onto its hinges. His headlights flashed against the stone structure as he pulled up. Officers Daniels and Murphy were already waiting outside. She's in there, Daniels whispered. Neighbors say they saw her slip inside about an hour ago. Reynolds nodded, unholstering his weapon as they stepped forward. The door groaned as he pushed it open. Inside, the church was cold, silent, except for the faint sound of breathing. Then in the dim glow of the moonlight, filtering through the broken windows, Reynolds saw her. Mia Jefferson sat at the foot of the pulpit, still in her bloodied wedding dress, her arms wrapped around her knees. Her face was streaked with dried tears, her eyes wide, unfocused. Reynolds slowly approached. "Mia?" She flinched but didn't move. "You're safe now," he said gently. "But I need to know what happened. I need to understand." Mia finally lifted her gaze, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, Detective," she murmured. "I didn't run because I was guilty." She swallowed hard, eyes dark with something deeper than fear. "I ran because I knew they'd come for me next." Reynolds' spine went rigid. "Who?" he asked, his voice low. Mia's lips trembled. "The people he works for," she said. "The ones who made him do it." Reynolds' stomach tightened. This case was no longer just about a betrayed bride and a wounded groom. There was something much bigger at play, and Mia Jefferson was the key to unraveling it. Detective Marcus Reynolds sat across from Mia Jefferson in a dimly lit interrogation room at the Atlanta Police Department. She had been given a change of clothes, gray sweats and a hoodie, but she still looked fragile, her bloodshot eyes darting nervously around the room. She hadn't spoken since they left the abandoned church. Now it was time for answers. Reynolds leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mia, you said Dominic works for people. Who are they?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't know their names, but I know what they do." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Officer Daniels, who stood in the corner, arms crossed. "Go on," Reynolds urged. Mia swallowed, her fingers clenching into fists. Dominic wasn't just a pastor. He was involved in something else, something dark. He always told me he had powerful friends, men who helped him build his ministry, get his church off the ground. But lately I started noticing things. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "What things?" She hesitated. "He had meetings late at night. He'd get phone calls and leave the room. He had money, more than a pastor should. But the scariest part? He changed. He became paranoid, jumpy. He told me that if I ever found out too much, it would be dangerous for both of us." Reynolds studied her carefully. "And then you walked in on him and Jared." Her jaw tightened. "Yes. And when I saw them, I realized something. I wasn't supposed to." She exhaled, gripping the edges of the table. "That wasn't just an affair. It was something else." Reynolds glanced at Daniels. They were both thinking the same thing. This wasn't about infidelity. It was about control. "Jared," Reynolds said, tapping his pen against the table. "How involved is he?" Mia shook her head. "I don't know, but he's always been around. Too close. The church loves him. He was the one who introduced Dominic to these friends. I think he's more than just a best man." Reynolds frowned. The best man, the one witness who had given them the most convenient version of events. He stood, motioning for Daniels to step outside with him. Once the door shut, Reynolds sighed. "Jared's lying. We need to bring him in for real questioning." Daniels nodded. "You think this is bigger than an affair?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. "I think Dominic's church was a front for something, and Mia just blew it wide open." Later that evening, confronting the best man, Jared McCall sat stiffly in the interrogation room, his confident demeanor cracking under Reynolds' cold stare. "I already told you what happened," Jared said, his voice tight. "Mia lost it and attacked Dominic. That's it." Reynolds folded his arms. "You know, Jared, the thing about lies is that they fall apart under pressure, and right now, yours is crumbling." Jared exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I'm not lying. Then why is Mia telling me that Dominic was involved with people who could kill her?" Reynolds challenged. Jared flinched, his Adam's apple bobbing. Reynolds leaned in. "Who were you really protecting that night? Because from where I stand, it sure as hell wasn't Dominic." Jared's lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but he hesitated. That was all the confirmation Reynolds needed. He smirked. "You're scared, which means we're getting close." Jared slammed his hands on the table. "You don't know what you're messing with," he blurted out. "Dominic, he wasn't supposed to marry her." Silence. Reynolds and Daniels exchanged a glance. Jared was breathing heavily now, sweat forming on his brow. They only let him have relationships with people they controlled. But Mia, she wasn't part of the plan. Reynolds sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about Dominic and Jared. This was about power, manipulation, and a secret society within the church. And now Mia was a loose end. Reynolds pressed his palms against the table. Jared, if you don't start talking, you're going to end up on their hit list just like Mia. So tell me, who are they? Jared swallowed hard. Then in a whisper, he finally spoke. The Covenant. Reynolds felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard that name before. A secret organization. Politicians, religious leaders, and businessmen who operated in the shadows, controlling everything from churches to elections. And now it seemed Dominic had been one of them. Mia wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a woman who had uncovered a deadly secret, and now they had to move fast before the Covenant silenced her for good. Detective Marcus Reynolds paced the dimly lit hallway outside the interrogation room. The name The Covenant lingered in his mind like a poison. He had heard whispers about them over the years, an underground network of influential figures controlling politics, religion, and finance. They were ghosts, impossible to pin down, and those who spoke too much about them had a way of disappearing. Now Jared McCall had just put a target on his back. Reynolds turned to Officer Daniels, who stood stiffly beside him. We need to move Mia. If what Jared is saying is true, she's not safe here. Daniels nodded. We could transfer her to a safe house outside the city. Reynolds exhaled. Do it. Quietly. As Daniels made the call, Reynolds re-entered the interrogation room. Jared sat slumped forward, his head in his hands. Tell me everything, Reynolds demanded, pulling up a chair. Jared let out a hollow laugh. You don't get it, detective. Knowing the truth doesn't mean you can stop them. He wiped his sweaty face and leaned in. Dominic was recruited years ago. He wasn't just some random pastor. They groomed him. His church, the funding, the influence, it all came from them. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Why would they invest in him? Jared sighed. Because they needed him to control people. Religion is power, detective. They placed him in that pulpit to push their messages, influence elections, and funnel money. But there was one rule: no outside relationships. Every partner had to be vetted, controlled. Mia was a problem because she was independent. They didn't own her. Reynolds leaned back, piecing it together. So the marriage wasn't just a betrayal to you, it was a betrayal to the Covenant. Jared nodded. Yeah, and they weren't happy about it. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Did they order you to do something about it? Jared hesitated. I tried to warn Dominic, but he was in too deep. He thought he could play both sides. That night, when Mia walked in on us, he panicked. He knew she'd talk, and if she talked, we'd both be dead. Reynolds clenched his jaw. So what was the plan? Silence her? Jared hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. I just know that Dominic called someone. He was scared out of his mind. He said they'd fix it. But when she bit him and ran, Jared's voice broke. That wasn't supposed to happen. Reynolds' stomach twisted. You're telling me someone else is cleaning up this mess? Jared nodded slowly. Yeah, and they won't stop until Mia is gone. 3 a.m. A race against time. Reynolds wasted no time. He stormed out of the interrogation room and grabbed his phone. Daniels had just finalized the transport orders for Mia. Cancel it, Reynolds said urgently. Daniels frowned. Why? They already know we have her. If the Covenant is as powerful as Jared says, they'll track any official transport. We need to move her off the grid. Daniels' expression darkened, but he nodded. I'll call in a favor. But what about Jared? Reynolds glanced back at the interrogation room. Keep him locked up. He's safer here than anywhere else. Minutes later, Reynolds entered the holding room where Mia sat. She looked up, her eyes filled with exhaustion and fear. We're getting you out of here, Reynolds said. She swallowed. Where? Somewhere they won't find you, he replied. As they stepped out of the station, Reynolds felt something shift in the air, a gut feeling, the kind that had saved his life before. Then he saw it, a black SUV parked down the street. No plates, tinted windows. Reynolds cursed under his breath. They were already here. He grabbed Mia's wrist. Run! Mia barely had time to react before Reynolds pulled her into a sprint, dodging through the alleys behind the precinct. Behind them, tires screeched. A car door slammed. Footsteps pounded against the pavement. Mia gasped for breath. Who are they? Reynolds didn't answer. He just ran faster. Because if the Covenant had come for Mia tonight, it meant one thing. They weren't planning to let her see the morning. Mia's lungs burned as she ran through the narrow alley, her pulse hammering in her ears. The footsteps behind them were growing louder. Reynolds kept a firm grip on her wrist, leading her through the maze of darkened back streets behind the precinct. The black SUV had moved, its tires screeching as it attempted to cut them off. They weren't going to make it on foot. Reynolds cursed under his breath and yanked Mia toward a rundown auto shop, its rusted sign barely legible in the dim glow of the streetlights. He pounded on the door. A gruff voice called from the other side. "Closed!" Reynolds pulled out his badge. "It's Reynolds. Open the damn door." There was a pause, then the door creaked open, revealing an older man with oil-stained hands and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Hell, Reynolds. What kind of mess you bringing me this time?" "No time to explain, Frank. We need a car. Something fast and unregistered." Frank grumbled but stepped aside. "Follow me." The auto shop smelled of gasoline and old rubber. Rows of half-repaired vehicles lined the garage, but Frank led them straight to the back. He pulled a tarp off a black Chevy Impala. "Keys are in it. Don't tell me where you're going." Reynolds nodded. "You didn't see us," Frank scoffed. "I never do." Reynolds shoved Mia into the passenger seat and floored the gas. The tires screeched as they tore out of the garage and onto the empty streets of Atlanta. Mia's hands trembled. Who the hell were they? Reynolds kept his eyes on the rearview mirror. The Covenant doesn't just cover their tracks, they erase them. If they're after you now, it means they don't just want you quiet, they want you gone. Mia exhaled shakily. "So what do we do?" Reynolds tightened his grip on the wheel. "We make them come to us, 3:45 a.m. The setup. Reynolds pulled into an abandoned lot on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by old warehouses. He killed the engine and turned to Mia. "If we keep running, they'll find us. We need to get ahead of them." Mia's brows furrowed. "How?" Reynolds pulled out his phone and dialed Daniels. "Reynolds, where the hell are you?" Daniels demanded, still breathing, but barely. "I need you to do something. Dig into Dominic's records, his calls, his bank statements, everything. Find out who he was connected to." Daniels hesitated. "You think you're going to outmaneuver these guys?" "I think I don't have a choice," Reynolds said. Daniels exhaled. "Fine, but you better be damn careful. If the Covenant is real, you just put a target on your own back." Reynolds hung up and turned to Mia. "Now we wait. 4:30 a.m. The bait takes." The phone vibrated. Daniel's voice was tense. "Got something? Dominic made a call 2 nights before the wedding to a burner phone. Trace the last known signal. It's registered to a warehouse off Auburn Avenue." Reynolds smirked. "Perfect." Mia frowned. "What's perfect about it?" Reynolds started the car. "It means we're about to meet the people who want you dead." Mia paled. "And that's a good thing?" Reynolds pulled the gun from his holster, checking the clip. "Depends. You good with a little payback?" Mia's lips parted, then slowly pressed into a firm line. "I've been waiting for it." Reynolds nodded. "Then let's crash a party." As he drove toward Auburn Avenue, a single thought ran through his mind. By sunrise, the Covenant would know his name, and they wouldn't forget it. Reynolds drove in silence, his grip tight on the wheel. The city was quiet at this hour, but danger lurked in the shadows. The warehouse on Auburn Avenue was just a few blocks away. If they were going to make a move, it had to be now. Mia sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched into fists. She wasn't just scared, she was angry. Her entire life had been upended in a single night. Her husband was dead. The Covenant wanted her gone. And now she was about to walk straight into the lion's den. Reynolds glanced at her. "You sure about this?" Mia exhaled sharply. "I'm done running." Reynolds nodded. "Good." He turned down a side street, parking a block away from the warehouse. He cut the engine and turned to Mia. "We go in quiet. No heroics. If we can get evidence, documents, recordings, anything, we take it. If things go south, we get the hell out." Mia swallowed and nodded. They stepped out of the car, moving swiftly toward the warehouse. The building was old, its metal siding rusted, the windows dark. There were two black SUVs parked outside, just like the one that had chased them earlier. Reynolds crouched near the side entrance, testing the door. Locked. He pulled a slim tool from his pocket, jamming it into the lock. Within seconds, the door clicked open. Mia exhaled. "You do that often?" Reynolds smirked. "Don't ask questions you don't want answers to." They slipped inside the beast's lair. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil and dust. Wooden crates lined the walls, and in the center of the room, a long table was set up with laptops and documents. A man in a gray suit stood at the head of the table, speaking in a low voice to two others. Reynolds recognized him immediately. Richard Calloway, a high-ranking political strategist with ties to some of the most powerful figures in the country. His presence here confirmed what Reynolds already suspected. The Covenant wasn't just a shadowy organization. It was woven into the very fabric of the system. Mia's breath hitched. She had seen Calloway before, at her wedding. He had been sitting in the front row. Reynolds motioned for her to stay low as he crept forward. He needed to hear what they were saying. "Loose ends need to be handled immediately," Calloway was saying. "McCall made a mistake bringing her into this. Now we have a trail leading straight to us." One of the men beside him shifted. "And the detective?" Calloway's expression darkened. "If he keeps digging, he dies too." Reynolds smirked. "That's going to be a problem." The men turned, their hands moving toward their weapons. Reynolds fired first. The silencer on his pistol muffled the shot, and the first man crumpled. The second lunged at him, but Mia grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and swung it hard, cracking the man across the head. Calloway reached for a gun, but Reynolds was faster. "Don't!" Reynolds said, leveling his pistol at him. Calloway raised his hands, his lips curling into a smirk. "You think this ends with me?" Reynolds stepped forward. "Number. But it starts with you." He grabbed a laptop from the table and shoved it into his bag. Then he motioned for Mia to follow him. As they backed toward the door, Calloway chuckled. "Run all you want, detective." "The Covenant doesn't forget." Reynolds smiled. "Neither do I." With that, he fired one last shot, straight into Calloway's knee. The man screamed, collapsing to the floor as Reynolds and Mia disappeared into the night. By sunrise, the evidence was in the hands of the FBI. The Covenant's operations were exposed. Their members scattered. Arrests were made, but Reynolds knew the fight wasn't over. Mia was placed under federal protection, her life forever changed. As for Reynolds, he returned to his office, poured himself a drink, and stared at the city skyline. The Covenant had been wounded, but they weren't dead. Not yet.